Welcome to the Polite Conversations podcast, where every episode is focused on civility, decorum, and good manners. And I'm your lovable, non-controversial host, Ina. If you know me, you know I definitely don't like to ruffle any feathers at all.
Boy, oh boy, oh boy. I have been sort of paralyzed since the election results were declared. I'm not even American, and I feel like the stakes were super high for the whole fucking world. I was in shock because of how much of a blatantly evil criminal Trump is, but otherwise, I suppose there's nothing to be too surprised by in hindsight. But this time around, in general, the US election seemed pretty hopeless to me. As soon as Biden's unwavering, deranged, blind support for Israel's atrocities became apparent, as soon as it was obvious there were no red lines, no number of shredded Palestinians that could make him stop supporting what Israel was doing, it seemed like we were fucked. And there was nowhere to turn, nowhere to seek relief or comfort, because the entire political spectrum of people in power were like this in the West. That seemed very ominous to me. It seemed like bad things were brewing for the collective future of the world, and here we are. In this US election, from my outside perspective, it seemed like there wasn't really much of a choice. If you'd been paying attention to the genocide unfolding in the Middle East, there was the naked, unapologetic fascism of the MAGAs plus Zionism, and the diet fascism of the Democrats plus Zionism. The Democrats who never seemed to learn a thing from their losses, unfortunately. I felt like, how could there be a lesser evil when both parties were genocidal? Like, what could be more evil than genocide? It seemed like the left was being held hostage by the Democrats, holding a Trump-shaped gun to their heads. And that just did not seem like a great strategy to me from early on. It did not seem like enough for a win. Then there was the assassination attempt on Trump, which I thought was going to be such a great propaganda win for them. I pretty much thought it was over then. And then there was Biden's very obvious cognitive decline, which certainly didn't provide much hope for the coming election either. It felt like the Democrats were truly doomed. But then something unlikely happened. Biden stepped down, and that dominated the news cycle. And the Trump thing didn't get as much play as I thought it would. And briefly, very briefly, Kamala provided some hope. There was momentum, something new and fresh was possible. Hopefully a break from Biden on anything, on fucking everything. But unfortunately, it turned out to be on nothing. Kamala, instead of making it a point to not be Biden 2.0, just leaned into more of the same. And when it came to genocide, that was really a deal breaker, understandably, for a lot of people. We'll never even know how many people just decided not to come out to vote at all because of that reason. But yeah, she tossed away so many opportunities to even signal very, very slightly that she was going to be different. She didn't even have to do that much. People were desperate, but she did nothing. And so the momentum died there, I think. Here's a clip of Kamala on The View that's been going around that captures that pretty well.
If anything, would you have done something differently than President Biden during the past 4 years?
There is not a thing that comes to mind. In terms of, and I've been a part of most of the decisions that have had impact.
Not a thing that comes to mind. Ugh, just awful, considering he's been known as Genocide Joe for the past year. I mean, come on. While this election was certainly not decided by Gaza, by the suffering of the Palestinians, it was one of the many, many, many mistakes that the Democrats made along the way. Just one more thing that could have helped sway things in their favor. Back in August, there was a poll done by YouGov and IMEU, which found that over a third of Democrat and independent voters in Pennsylvania, Arizona, and Georgia were more likely to vote for a Democrat if they pledged to withhold weapons from Israel. And there were similar results when they were asked if they'd vote for the Democratic nominee if they secured a ceasefire. Dems, of course, completely ignored that polling, carried on arming Israel, gaslighting and lying about working towards a ceasefire. And I think back to so many instances like this, and I think, why? Why the refusal to have a Palestinian voice vetted and everything included at the DNC? Why send Bill fucking Clinton, of all people, to do Israel apologetics in Michigan, of all places? There were times I was just thinking, what are they doing? Do they just not want to win, or what? I mean, of course, there are many lenses to look at the election results through, but one undeniable one is that a majority of Americans simply prefer fascism at this moment. And liberal establishments just haven't dealt with the growth of right-wing extremism. They haven't effectively tried to counter it or anything. Most Americans chose this in this election, knowingly, with their eyes wide open. Trump has won the first popular vote for Republicans in 20 years. That, for me, is possibly harder to deal with than winning the Electoral College. Because what does that say about such a large chunk of people? People that are neighbors of mine, essentially. We can talk about all the reasons that they may prefer fascism right now, or why fascism wasn't a deal breaker for them, why they've been driven to it, and we will, but the bottom line here is that they simply do prefer it. It is only in a nightmarishly racist and sexist world that a clownish candidate like Trump could even be a threat, let alone win. Twice. And most recently, after being convicted as a felon and facing no consequences for inciting a violent insurrection. He shouldn't even be eligible to run in a healthy democracy. The Dems had 4 years to do something about it. Now they're helping to wind down his criminal cases. I mean, just imagine. He's been re-elected to the White House as a fucking convicted felon. First ever convicted felon president in American history. After also being shown very publicly to be a rapist. And I'm not just saying that. A judge and jury made it very clear that he did in fact rape Jean Carroll. He is a literal rapist. It's on record, and he is in charge of the most powerful country in the world. He has been chosen by millions of people after declaring his desires to be a dictator. This is who majority of the country voted for. I don't think someone could be hired into even a retail job or at a fast food place if such things were known about them by their employer. I don't know how such a person could be allowed into the nation's highest office. The whole system is so fucked. And when the Dems have power, they don't seem to do much to change it. I think that is at the core of the issue. You know, aside from truly trying to understand the scale and volume of American extremism that exists now, the slide to the far, far right, the unchecked racism, the growing sexism, misogyny, homophobia, transphobia, and general hatred of minorities, we have to really grapple with just how bad the Democrats must be that this has happened to them twice. That they've lost to someone like Trump twice. I mean, sure, Kamala didn't have much time, and he is also a very unique opponent that has tapped into something very dark and disturbing in his base. the worse he gets. The more corruption and immorality he displays, the more hatred he spews. He just seems to inspire more and more of the worst people's adoration. Like back in the first time, 2016, I for sure very naively thought once the grab them by the pussy tape was out that he was done. Little did I know his fan base would love that about him. Officially being a rapist, tapes of Epstein saying he was Trump's closest friend, none of that has the normal effect it should on his base. So yeah, Trump is a bizarre opponent. Digging up dirt on him does not work. His brand is being despicable. And second, gosh, the Democrats are really not offering much, are really not good at telling a clear story and having a strong message. And instead of going in another direction, away, far, far away from Trump, they try to lean gently into the right-wingery themselves. If they keep trying to do that diet fascism without realizing that people who find that alluring will always, always vote for the original straight-up fascism over a watered-down version, if they don't actually appeal to the left and spend their time courting the right and the so-called center, they will unfortunately keep losing. They don't offer any real change. They don't offer any real strength or fight against their opponents. They are too busy being above that or something. Remember, when they go low, we go high. I'm sorry, but when you're repeatedly being punched in the dick by a serial liar who's claiming that you're doing the punching, you cannot go high. You have to fight back. The Democrats offer maintenance of a horrendous status quo, and especially in a post-pandemic, economically tough time, that is just not going to cut it. Throughout history, economic woes and instability lead to a rise in fascism. Instability in different regions leads to migration, and that, when combined with financial woes and a growing emboldened far right, leads to ethno-nationalism, which is where we're at now. Not to mention, this local election stuff is all happening against the backdrop of global, especially Western suppression of critical opinions on Israel, of the Democrats enabling and supporting apartheid, genocide, and far-right ethno-nationalism quite openly abroad, the Democrats suppressing student protests through unbelievable police brutality on leftists. So aside from their own underlying fascism, whatever this milquetoast, toothless, centrist stuff they project is, it's just not a good enough barrier against MAGA's extreme aspirations. The whole world is in the grips of a very fascist and extreme moment. Netanyahu, Modi, Trump, Meloni, Orban, Putin. It is bad. And soft-pedaling this shit is not getting us anywhere. The Democrats may talk the talk. They may be on the surface level, warning about Trump and Trumpism, but their actions or lack of action actually tells a very different story. They need to be on the offensive, like hardcore. They need to provide a solid, strong, and clear alternative, not lean into more of the same, time and time again. Honestly, more than ever now, I have such rapidly declining patience for centrists because they really are the ones ushering in the extremism, normalizing it, while gently wagging their finger at it, of course. But we have to learn to recognize that as a red flag. Reactionary centrism. It's not neutral or rational. It is right-wing friendly, right-wing adjacent. I mean, for every rational bro that tells me Sam Harris is absolutely not racist or right-wing, Sam radicalizes about 50 people. And then about 50 more people are radicalized for each centrist, legitimizing him, especially in the middle of a genocide. But yeah, speaking of reactionary centrism, why was courting Liz Cheney a thing? Why was a Dick Cheney endorsement not a moment of embarrassment? I really hope Democrats reflect on that. Like, who are they appealing to with that? David Frum? And like, who else? And one thing I want to stress is, look, Trump is not the only Republican fascist out there. He's a symptom of a much wider problem. I really have concerns about people just pouring all their criticism, anger, and hatred into one guy without recognizing that pretty much everyone he's surrounded by is also part of the problem. A party that accepts him is part of the problem. It's a lot like people who try to make Netanyahu the sole issue in Israel, as if his opponent would be any less genocidal. It's baked into the society. It's not just the one guy. We need to understand and identify that first as an issue before we can even begin to tackle it. Centrist liberals don't tend to do that. Kamala wanted a Republican on her cabinet if she was elected, for fuck's sake.
Listen, I plan on having a Republican in my cabinet.
I got a list.
Yeah, right. You asked me what's the difference between Joe Biden and me. Well, that will be one of the differences. I'm going to have a Republican in my cabinet because I don't feel burdened by letting pride get in the way of a good idea.
Yeah.
She did not have a minute to give Palestinian voices at the DNC, but she wanted to appoint a Republican. What message does that send? That she and the Democrats prefer appealing to the right, not the left. But look, as awful as all this sounds, it's not all doom and gloom. We can certainly learn from this moment. That is the important takeaway here. Hopefully Democrats take the time to look inwards. I mean, so far that's not looking promising, but I hope they take a moment to think about whether focusing on things like a stricter border policy and a more lethal fighting force in the middle of a brutal live stream genocide was a good idea.
I will ensure America always has the strongest, most lethal fighting force in the world.
Whether protecting corporate interests or bankrolling Israel's endless mass murder at the expense of a population that is hurting financially was worthwhile, or whether ignoring and alienating many young people and leftists who have been vocalizing, who have been pleading with the Biden administration to do something about the genocide, whether alienating them was helpful. And if they actually reflect on these things, hopefully they come back with a new vision, some actual change, some actual fight against the right, some fire in their belly, a type of fire that would have made sure Trump saw consequences for his crimes in the first place. And I mean, they won't do that on their own. We have to keep pushing them. There are just so many things that contributed to this loss. I'm really struggling with how many flaws there were and how unnecessary a loss to someone like Trump really is. But despite that, despite all the flaws and failures of the Democrats, we can't discount the fact that unbridled racism and misogyny were undeniably top factors, of course. I know many people are already trying to downplay that side of things, but come on, you know that a lot of folks just didn't want a woman, especially a Black and South Asian woman, to win. As awful as you may think she is, and I do, believe me, we need to acknowledge this side too. It's a great moment for rapists and sex pests and white nationalists around the world. It has been sickening to see Andrew Tate posting his pro-rape stuff gleefully. Nick Fuentes tweeted, "Your body, my choice, forever." Russell Brand, another rapist, was flaunting his MAGA hat. Watching all that has been so painful and frightening as a woman. I was already feeling so hurt and betrayed by Western feminist silence on the issues women are facing in Gaza that this is just compounding the hurt and fear. It just does not feel like a safe time. I know there are people acting like these are two opposing issues, people devastated by Gaza and the ones hurting from Trump winning, but they're only that way if you make them. You do not have to pit these issues against one another. We can hurt for women in Gaza, the destruction, the mass slaughter, and we can hurt for women in this part of the world too. There is a literal rapist in charge with other rapists celebrating it. Abortion access should matter as well as the genocide. It's not one or the other, though I've seen many people make it out to be. You can be critical of Democrats and of Kamala, and you can keep pushing for them to do better. And you can also recognize that Trump will make everything worse for everyone. He literally uses Palestinian as a slur. It's a strange time. Emotions are so high, stakes are so high, that I've been seeing so much infighting, even on the pro-Palestine left. Publications and outlets that I'd consider very critical of Israel are being accused of being Zionists. People that have stood up and vocally used their platforms to advocate for Palestinians are being called white liberals who don't care about Palestine, only because they are upset about a Trump win. Look, I get that desire to want to see the Democrats be held accountable for their awfulness, for their aiding and abetting of literal war crimes, while they pretended to care about human rights. But what I don't get is thinking that a Trump win is a suitable punishment, because it punishes us all, including Palestinians who had it bad enough already under the Democrats. Netanyahu wins regardless, but this is the outcome he was hoping for specifically. Oh, and another thing you can add to the list of things that went wrong is COVID. COVID scrambled so many people's brains and made them ripe for radicalization. And then there's also the fact that while right-wingers have spent a lot of time, money, and energy on their garbage media, their disinformation machine, their propaganda, and their propagandists in the past few years, the so-called liberal media has spent all last year losing credibility and gaslighting and both sidesing a genocide and firing people for speaking out against it. They're also always trying to be overly charitable to the right, accepting their anti-woke framing, representing right-wing voices. I mean, this is the right which does not hesitate to smear, slander, lie, and cheat. When I say lie, I mean straight up just making shit up. Here's Bari Weiss on Fox News, completely fabricating stuff that suits her agenda, to pin the loss on a familiar, convenient narrative that has nothing to do with reality.
How can progressives win again? By looking at what went wrong here, by taking this moment and allowing it not to be a retrenchment of the idea of, half of Americans want a fascist regime. They don't.
They literally voted for the open fascist. So I'd say they do. And this is not just the woke saying it. Trump's own former White House Chief of Staff, John Kelly, said Trump is a fascist. He said in The Atlantic recently that Trump had once expressed that he wished his military personnel showed him the same deference Adolf Hitler's Nazi generals showed him during World War II. Bari Weiss, she has some very Fauci friends herself, like posh white nationalist Douglas Murray. She has been attacking education, universities, diversity, and free speech for as long as I've known of her. Bari quite clearly supports fascism, both at home and in Israel. So I would not be taking advice on what progressives need to do to win from her, of all people.
Of the idea of, half of Americans want a fascist regime. They don't. They want a good life for themselves and their families.
Right. And a good life for themselves and their families often means denying others. If you'd like to access the extended version of this episode, please subscribe via patreon.com/nicemangoes. We'll continue discussing Bari Weiss, and Sam Harris and Andrew Sullivan may come up as well.
Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed this episode and would like to support it, there are several ways you can do that. You can share it online, talk about what you just heard. You can leave a 5-star review to help others find it too. And you can also subscribe via patreon.com/nicemangoes. No E in mangoes. If you'd like to follow me on Twitter before it's completely wrecked, you'll find me at Nice Mangoes. Again, no E in mangoes.